Thank you, Ben, for that very kind introduction. So can everyone up the back hear me? Yep? Yes. I did that once at a country pub, and they said, the person at the back said, I can, but I'm happy to swap with someone who can't. So make for that when you will. Look, I actually didn't want to speak for too long, and I don't want to rant for too long, because I actually wanted to have a chance to have a few questions and have a bit of a discussion. But I wanted to put a slightly different perspective on what's really going on in Australian politics, because I think there's something fundamentally wrong and rotten with the entire system, almost regardless of where your political persuasions will sit. So let's just park everyone's politics for a moment, whether you're pro-Labor or Green or Liberal or minor party or whatever, and just have a broader discussion about where power lies and why power lies where power lies. And I have to say, yes, I'm reasonably a younger member of Parliament. I was the General Secretary of the New South Wales branch of the Labor Party before I came into Parliament. I was born in a small town in northern Iran. I came to Australia as a 5-year-old during the Iran-Iraq War. That's kind of my story, and in about an hour I tell that story, and I tell it often, so you probably don't really want to hear that. But I have to say, the thing that shocked me by coming to Canberra in the past 2 years is really about this fundamental question of who runs the country and where power actually rests. Because look, I didn't come to this place as some kind of, wild-eyed, kind of blind, naive, kind of local community activist who suddenly, through some miracle chance, got elected to Parliament on some fluke swing in some seat because of some community effort. You will not find somebody who came more from the ALP machine than me. Like, I'm a product of the machine like you would not believe. I joined the Labor Party when I was 16. I took over my first branches by the time I was 17. I got called into the ALP head office when I was still in my school uniform at 17 to be told that, my career was over because I'd taken over the whole northern part of Sydney and this. And by 18, they were using my delegates as votes at conference, right? So I didn't want to pretend, I've come to this as some kind of naive, and this talk has shocked me so much about what's so rotten about it, is perhaps I thought I understood power, and I thought I understood the brutality of politics simply by my time in the New South Wales Labor Party and my time in the New South Wales Labor machine. Again, New South Wales Labor Party, I was there when the whole place completely collapsed on itself. I was there throughout the kind of Gillard Rudd period. And none of that braced me for an understanding of just how concentrated, brutal, and aggressive a handful of businesses operate, and the real corporate power where it actually rests in this country. And that's the bit that's actually blown away in the past couple of years. And again, I didn't think I came to it from a kind of naive kind of position. Look, here's the big question. There's something fundamentally wrong at the heart of the Australian condition. We're getting healthier. We're getting wealthier on an aggregate kind of level. We're living for longer. Every socio-economic indicator says things are getting better and better and better. Yet, there's this huge, deep unease at the heart. People are feeling like they're under an incredible amount of pressure. They're under time pressure. They're under social pressure. They're under economic pressure. And there's this incredible growing inequality. There is something fundamentally wrong with a country where the top 7 Australians, 7 people, have more wealth than the bottom 20%. 4.6 million people at the bottom are worth the same as the 7 richest Australians. Where in the past 40 years, 10%, right, the top 10% have seen their wages grow in real terms by $47,000, when the bottom 10% have seen them grow by $7,000. There is something fundamentally wrong at the heart of this. And the question that I've been kind of asking is, how is it that our policy settings can be so wrong? How is it that our policy agenda can be so kind of off-putting? And how is it that you can have these kinds of decisions constantly being made that really at the end of the day have only served a very small elite minority of people over a long period of time? And the reality is this. Doesn't matter how you want to break this down. There are 10 companies that really wield the most incredible amount of power in Australia. 10 companies. 4 banks, and we all know who they are. The Commonwealth Bank, the NAB, Westpac, ANZ. 3 big mining companies in Rio, in BHP and in Fortescue. You've got your 2 big kind of grocery chains. And you've got your big telco, which is Telstra. 10 companies. And it really doesn't matter how you kind of want to break this up, right? If you want to do it in terms of employees, the 4 banks have 170,000 people they employ. The 2 grocery chains do 400,000. 3 miners do 145,000. The telco, Telstra, does about 40,000. If you want to do it in taxes paid, and when we get to questions, there's a whole different story about taxation. We'll talk about that. But the banks pay about 10 billion in tax. The miners pay about 7.5 billion in income tax, plus they pay royalties to states. Again, that's a whole other issue. The grocery chains pay about 2 billion, and Telstra pays about 2 billion, which will vary from year to year. But what you have is this unprecedented concentration of corporate influence. And what's not unprecedented isn't there's a handful of companies that are powerful or that are big. That happens. It happens especially in an economy kind of the size of Australia, but also the nature of Australia. What's happened now is the entire political debate has become so dominated by the interests that they're pushing and the agenda that they're pushing. And you end up with this complete crowding out of a proper political discourse in this country, because there is one sectional interest that is so much louder than every other voice out there that's combined. So, what I mean is, there is nothing wrong with successful businesses. There's nothing wrong necessarily with big businesses, provided there's adequate levels of competition and you've got proper regulators. Nothing wrong with that. We want successful Australian businesses. We want them to do well. We also want them to pay their taxes, which is a different matter. But all of these are good things. The problem has become when their lobbying effort and their power within our system and our structure is so strong and so complete that everyone else is being crowded out. So I just want to run through a couple of kind of debates, and I'll give you an example. You look at a situation with the 4 big banks. You cannot walk through Parliament and not fall over the lobbyists that the banks have employed, right? You can't. They are everywhere, right? And you have a situation where, when the banks are in trouble, let's be clear about this, right? They were the first people during the GFC asking to have their bailouts, right? And what they got in the Australian context was the deposit guarantees. Now, we believe we guaranteed somewhere between $600 to $700 billion worth of deposits. We say we believe because we're actually not sure. It was such a big number and it was done so quickly. We're even unclear on exactly what it was, right? But when you have a situation like when someone like David Murray is the former CEO of the Commonwealth Bank who just did the review. This isn't some Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, anti-bank kind of crusader. I mean, this is from the inside. Comes out and says something which is eminently reasonable and says this: if the banks are too big to fail, then what can we do to make them more infallible? And perhaps greater capital requirements is something that...
more infallible?
Sorry.
More fallible.
Sorry, you're right. What can we do? What we should do is turn around and give them greater capital requirements, place them with greater capital requirements. The fight back, the pushback, when we turn around and we go, hang on, look at how you've actually treated victims of financial misconduct. Look what happened with Commonwealth Bank. What happened prior to the FOFA legislation, the Future Financial Advice. Incredible. I mean, look, criminal activity, a complete and utter rot of behaviour that was happening at a systemic level. Yet, the fight, the push, the argument, the pushback that comes back from that ends up dominant. When you end up with a reasonable proposition that comes on miners, which says this, right? Look, if you're going to be making an obscene amount of profit by ripping our resources out of the ground, you should, by taking a risk, and doing that activity in a safe and reliable way, you should be entitled to make profit as a business. No one's, we're not opposing that as principle, but if you're making obscene amounts of money by doing this, and considering these are national resources, perhaps some of that money should be redirected towards things like the low-income super scheme, so the lowest paid Australians actually have a bit more to retire on. A little bit of that money should actually be redirected towards a school kids bonus, because families are doing it tough enough. And even some of that money should be redirected towards some tax breaks for some smaller businesses, because hey, how about we let some of the smaller businesses grow into bigger businesses as well? You have the mother of all campaigns being run by the mining lobby. And I just want to give you some figures. The year before the mining tax was introduced, the mining company's advertising spend was $68,000. For the 3 years, which was the duration of that kind of mining campaign fight, they spent somewhere close to $37 million in advertising. Then they went back to spending $50,000. Why? Because $40 million in advertising to fight a government is a lot cheaper than actually paying a tax. And that was the cost-benefit analysis that was done. I can go on about the grocery chains and the fights that they constantly have with the ACCC and the work the ACCC does. I can talk about Telstra and the position and how they fought tooth and nail about different parts of NBN code to make sure that they end up with the most profitable part. But fundamentally, this is the problem. The problem is that you have a handful of incredibly loud voices that are the loudest voices in the room. And what they've done over the past 20, 25 years is make sure that nobody else is really being heard. So when we talk about things like education funding, when we talk about things like the money that's being torn out of health, what we don't have is an ability to actually have the voices that we need heard being heard in these debates. Because when the power is so concentrated, when influence is so concentrated, when the voices are so concentrated in a handful of incredibly powerful lobbyists, what ends up happening is that no one else ends up getting heard in that debate. Now, there are instances where there's a fight back, and there are instances where it works. On the issue of the future of kind of financial advice and victims of financial crime, it took an enormous campaign, which involved choice, which involved council of the aging, which involved kind of national seniors, which involved a whole series of victims groups. People like Ben and others and the Australian Institute were involved in all this, bringing together a coalition of interest to actually be able to effectively fight the Financial Services Council and the Australian Banking Association to make a couple of banks pay up for what was clearly breaches of their own responsibility. And unfortunately, when money isn't involved, it's even harder. And so what makes groups like the Australian Institute so important is making sure there are other voices. What makes this organisation so important is making sure there is other debates and other parts of the debate. Now, that's where I think we've been up until now. I think things are changing, and I think things are going to change. There is an anger out there. There is a frustration. You can call it what you will, but people are pissed off. They're sick and tired of it. They're angry about what they've seen happen. And we've seen this really as a trend internationally, and I think it's a trend that we're going to increasingly see in Australia. Internationally now, look, while how it manifests itself is different in different places. But of course there's a common thread between what happens with Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn or even Le Pen in France. Right? What the common thread is a sense of frustration and anger when people go, enough is enough. That there is a system here that we feel excluded from. That we feel like we have no more power in our show anymore. And that we actually want to have a say and need to have a say. And I think that's going to drive a massive change in the next couple of years in Australian politics. And I think what it's going to mean for politicians, which I care about more than you guys care about. But I think what it means for politicians really is either you understand the system has to change, is going to change, needs to change, and will change, and you try and change the system to achieve those social and other objectives that you believe in, or you end up just getting washed out with the tide.
open to your questions, but I might start first. What happened to the leading figure of the New South Wales right, the machine man who was after power for power's sake, that turned him into somebody who can give one of the best exposés and explanations of corporate power in Australia that looks like a kind of Marxist critique of Australian society?
Well, I mean, it's fair to say that during my time as the party secretary of New South Wales, I was often the Stalinist reference, so we'll park that for a moment. But I've got to say, it just blew me away about just how kind of centralised it was. And it was this really, the bit that actually got me angry was the banks. The banks really got me angry, right? Because let's cut the bullshit, right? We give the banks an implicit subsidy, right? We protect the banks like you would not believe. We have a system designed to ensure that they cannot fail. You know, the four pillars, the banking system, the structures that we have, you know, people like Richard are experts in this, they can talk about this a lot better than I could. But effectively there is an implicit subsidy there to protect them. And the system and the show and the Australian public have been so good to Australian banks, have been so protective of Australian banks, have effectively rigged the system to make sure they're profitable, to make sure they're wealthy, to make sure they're successful. And in some part, you know, you can argue that's a good thing. You know, 25 or so years of now uninterrupted economic growth is in part because we have an incredibly efficient and successful banking sector, right? But you think that with that would come a certain sense of corporate responsibility, that with that would come a sense of responsibility that, hang on, that because of this implicit subsidy, because the system has been so good to us, even if you're going to argue solely for the base of shareholder value, you could argue quite successfully that, hey, if this system has been so good to you, the best way to protect the system is to do the right thing by the system. And that's the best way to do the right thing by your shareholders as your own fiduciary duty. You can argue that. Yet, when you saw the way that they hid, they lied, they spun, especially, I mean, with what happened with CBA, over what is really pissing amounts of money by the size of a bank, simply as the principle of we should never have to pay. Look, you can't sit with these people and not get them.
Over to you. I've got a microphone here, so one here at the front and then one at the back, mid back there.
I don't need a microphone.
Just hang on a second. I've got one here first, and then we'll come to you, mate.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
That's all right.
Comrade Senator, you talked about the changing system, and one of the cornerstones that will see that change will be when we, the people, have confidence in the integrity of the system. And one of those things that you talked about today was undue influence, or the Big Ten essentially wielding power. And if you think about any issue, one of those companies has some involvement in it, whether it be through the pokies and things like that as well. Why are our major parties fighting returning confidence to the people? Why are our parties fighting through federal ICAC type arrangements, actually return the confidence to the people that would demonstrably remove that question?
That's actually a really, really good question. Firstly, I actually think we need to go one step a little bit further. My position's probably a little bit more extreme than actually even a federal ICAC. I think what the Brits have and what they have in New Zealand, which is the Serious Fraud Office, is actually the way that these things should be handled, which is effectively look at both the public and the private sector. Right? So you need an agency or a body that is able to look at both public and private. You know, so be it fraud at the Commonwealth Bank or fraud at a political office, you know, be able to look at both of them once they reach a serious kind of threshold is the way to do it. And that's something I've been arguing for a little while now. But I just want to bring you to the broader point, which I think you're making, rather than just the specific point. There is always going to be, within any kind of a system, a resistance to giving up power. You know? There is always going to be a rigidity and a resistance to that. And inherently, political parties are inherently hostile to the notion of the decentralisation of power. And that's been a political trend for a long period in any kind of political institution. And I think it's a huge, huge challenge. My point to my party has always been, either, you can be a smaller part of a larger pie or be part of a diminishing organisation. That's really the options that are available to you. You're not going to go back to the kind of 1950s, 1960s model. That's dead, right? So it's either you embrace the future or you get washed out. I think that's the real kind of direction, and I think that's the real challenge. But you raise a really kind of good point, and I think that's the right point, which is where does this resistance kind of come from? There is an inherent inertia within political parties.
One back here, and then Richard over here.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the oxymoron on corporate responsibility. When you talked also earlier about the lobbyists and the pressure, how do you resist that pressure? How do your colleagues cope with that? How do they deal with it, particularly in both houses and particularly in the prospects? Because it must be incessant, it must be very, very difficult to resist that over a long period of time, particularly with contentious issues.
And I'm happy to talk about election donation reforms too, if you want to get to that point too. Look, the problem with the lobbying, and I just want to be clear what I think the real problem here is. The problem isn't that there are certain sectional interests that have loud voices, right? That's fine, right? I think it's not a bad thing that banks have lobbyists and banks are able to come and argue their case and argue the case of their shareholders. And we can talk about the two big kind of supermarket chains. They do employ 400,000 people. I mean, that is a lot of people who are employed by them. They're important players in an economy. They deserve to have their voice. The problem is that when they're the only people talking, where they're the only people you hear, two things happen. Firstly, only their agenda gets heard. And secondly, no other agenda gets heard. So yeah, it's a lot harder to hear from teachers and school principals and mums and dads talk about what happens when you cut $30 billion from school funding, right, than it is to hear from a handful of lobbyists from a sectional interest group when you remove $50 million that directly affects them, but they're prepared to put $5 million into an advertising campaign.
One, Richard here.
Oh God, this is going to be scary.
Hey Sam, it's Richard. Richard Dennis from the Australian Institute. Can I just start by saying in 7 years of the politics in the pub that I've come to, that's the best speech I've ever heard. So, thank you. I guess my question is, sorry, does that work?
No.
My question is, does it take experience of power that you had before you came to Parliament to recognise power when you got to Parliament? And no, I mean that. I think a lot of people come to Parliament motivated by representing someone or with a great policy idea. Not many people wield power before they get stuck in a powerful position. So do you think that helps? And if so, what do we do to dissipate this incredible power that I agree is dominating public debate? How might I put it? Do we divide and conquer?
Okay, well, there's 2 points there. I think you're overplaying my power or influence before coming to politics. There's actually the godfather of the New South Wales right was actually this guy called John Ducker, who used to have this saying, which was, to understand power, you have to not have it. Which I think is an old kind of commie line from years ago, which is to understand hunger, you have to have been hungry. I think it's more a socialist saying from way back. But look, I don't know the answer to the first part of the question, to be honest, which is, I thought I understood power. I thought I understood how power in this country kind of worked. And I really was just shocked by myself, by realising just where the power actually rests. I thought the power lied in political parties and in organisations and elections, and sure, around the edges there's campaign techniques and there's clever ads and there's slogans and this and that, and then you come to Canberra and realise, no, it's actually way more concentrated than that. If you actually take a step back and realise, does the power really rest with politicians who come and go and prime ministers who change every couple of years, and we've had about 5 years and this and that, or does the power rest in the sectional interests that seem to be there and surviving throughout? Right? I mean, is the power really with Tony Abbott, or is the power with the Minerals Council doing everything they could possibly ever want? Tony Abbott now sits on the back bench. Not that I'm obviously a fan of his policy agenda, I'm just making the observation. Firstly, on the second part of your question, two parts. Firstly, I think it's naturally going to change. That's the international trend. And it's not settled yet. People don't know what it means. Right? So you talk to, I obviously have a lot to do with the Labour Party, a lot to do with the British Labour Party, and they look at kind of the Jeremy Corbyn phenomenon, and they go, what does that mean? Right? Why is that the case? Right? Does that mean, I think it means two things. I think firstly, it's clearly a rejection of large parts of the Blair agenda. Right? That's part of it. But secondly, it's just a rejection and an anger at the way politics in the Labour Party was being run over there, and a sense that the party and the movement felt they no longer had a say, and perhaps they overcompensated, and that's a debate you can have, but it also can help explain Trump and others, and Le Pen and Sanders. And as different as those political movements may seem to be, they're a rejection of politics as normal. I think that's where we're heading at the moment. I think what you do with the Australian Institute is so important because it's part of that. But I think increasingly we're going to be heading down that trend in the next couple of years. How it manifests itself, I don't know. But I know it's not going to be business as usual because, we saw this in this multinational tax thing. Right? I remember. Because, let's face it, tax is fucking boring. Right? That is, right? The idea, tax debates are really, really boring shit, like they are. Everyone's kind of sick of the same kind of, this kind of normal thing and that. And you suddenly realise, hang on, there's this huge ground source of understanding. And people get it. They kind of get the fact, hey, there's something wrong in the system, which means, Google gets to pay this much. And I pay so. When you have cleaners paying more than the cleaning companies they work for in terms of taxes. The largest cleaning company in Australia pays less tax than each one of its cleaners. Right? When you have that happening, you go to yourself, people get angry and they actually get motivated. I think that's what's starting to change, but I actually do think we're probably a little bit behind the international trend, and I don't know why.
One here and one here in the middle.
Again, a two-part question. You didn't mention anything about the power of the multinationals and how the TPP might change the balance of power in Australia. And the second part is that in Ross Gitting's article today, when he's reviewing a book on the banks, I think he quotes something like that only 3% of the bank's transactions as far as lending for actual projects that are going to deliver everything, and all the rest is between the banks moving money around between themselves. Isn't that a good case to put some sort of transaction tax on
Look, I'll answer the second part first. I'm not going to purport to be. I haven't read Ross's article today. What Ross writes is normally brilliant, but I can't comment on the specifics of that. And I'm not quite sure around the economics, or I haven't seen any modelling around that. Maybe the Australian Institute can do some modelling on it for us. To your kind of first part, the power of multinationals. Now, I want to talk about it in two respects. Firstly, in terms of taxation. And I just want to give you this bullshit straw man argument you get about them, which is this. If you make multinational companies pay tax, they'll leave Australia, which is rubbish. Rubbish. They're here for a whole host of reasons, right? A whole host of reasons. The main reason they're here is because it's profitable for them to be here. That's the main reason they're here, right? That's like your stuff, right? So while it is more profitable for them to be here than to not be here, they're going to stay. And I reject the premise that you have to have a scenario that says that, either they don't pay tax and stay, or they go pay that. You can do both. You should do both. We are taxing profit. They are still profitable businesses. There is still money to be made here. They make their decisions based on whether or not there's money to be made or not money to be made. It doesn't mean you don't have to be internationally competitive at some level, but the idea that we're going to participate in some kind of a race to the bottom with Singapore that has really no tax rate, like you can negotiate it down. Hong Kong, I think, allegedly has a 12.5%, or Ireland has 12.5%, and, Dutch, wherever, or hanging on. The idea that we're going to compete for some kind of race to the bottom is just false. the broader argument you're making about the role of multinationals and the TPP, I actually think in the Australian political debate, the power of multinationals, as spooky and evil as they are, isn't that large. I think you'll find the real lobbying effort comes from a lot of the actual Australian companies.
Woman there at the back. You shout out or you...
No, yeah, I'm over here first.
Okay, we'll have one there and then over here.
The mic's not, I don't think the mic's, is that working?
Just give it a shout.
Thank you for such good speech. In your speech, you mentioned, you talked about like the oligopolies and the monopolies of like the mining companies and like the supermarkets and that. What strategies do you think people in like the political discourse can somehow come up with to increase competition in those sectors to break up those oligopolies and that?
Well, look, that's actually a really good point. And this is the irony of the whole thing, right? Like, you can actually throw away this paradigm of left-right, right? I mean, the reality is the best solution to a lot of these challenges is better competition. There is actually a market-based solution to a lot of these problems, and that is making sure you have a better, more competitive kind of environment and more competitive system in place, right? And firstly, you've got to, look, the work the ACCC, the work the Rod Sims does is incredible and amazing, with nowhere near enough resources or anywhere near enough power. I mean, the idea that you should have a regulator with teeth is where you begin. And just have a look at the budget cuts that the ACCC has been facing over, especially the past few years. Devastating. Devastating. Right? So if you're not going to have proper regulation of the rules you already have, it is not easy for a regulator to fight petrol companies, Coles and Wills and others, and that, on what it does to petrol prices. And the ACCC is prepared to do it. And really, Rod Sims is actually a real kind of superstar. He does an amazing job, and I think he deserves credit for what he does. But the idea that says, a more competitive market-based solution, which is actually, a kind of a right-wing solution about saying there needs to be better competition, is where I think the debate can and needs to go. And I think it's disappointing that the debate we were having as a nation about an effects test effectively got shut down, because I thought I was heading into an interesting space about where you go in terms of competition policy. Now, there's two different views on an effects test, whether it's effective or not. That's a debate in itself. It's a good debate to have. I think those debates are healthy for a nation. But the solution as part of this is going to be greater competition. And I just want to give everyone just one kind of example of the ridiculousness of the system. Credit cards. I just want to introduce you to an incredible profitable part of banking. Right? Credit cards worth about $8.5 billion in the industry in terms of what kind of risk. Right? Your credit card, the cost of borrowing money at the moment is about, cash rate, has been fluctuating around 2%. Right? We'll talk about a 2% figure over the past recent time period, right? For the banks. You get credit card rates of around 22%. As we've seen consistently over the past 7 years, the rate of the cost of borrowing money for credit card rates have stayed the same. Right? And you go to yourself, well, why is that? There's so much competition. Well, is there really? There is 85% of the entire market is controlled by the 4 banks. What incentive is really there for them to have a competition to drive themselves down to the bottom? The statistic that's really worrying? You are more likely to cheat on your spouse than you are to change your bank in Australia.
So first of all, I want to put in a shameless plug for a new organisation called the Canberra Alliance for Participatory Democracy. And if you're actually interested in getting together with a bunch of other people who are working on these same issues, then come along and join us at this website. 2 questions really. The first one is really about what can we expect from the Labor Party in this space? People of my generation have always looked, I think, to the Labor Party to provide the narrative about why the policy settings are the way they are. We had Medibank private because we knew we had to keep the other insurers honest. We had the Commonwealth Bank in public hands because we knew we had to keep the banks honest. We had a Labor Party that was prepared to stand up and argue their case for those things, but at this point, you really get the sense that the Labor Party's also lost its nerve in the face of the onslaught of corporate lobbying, and yet the changes aren't stopping. The Harper Competition Review will bring in competition policy into the social service sector and completely change the face of that sector and corporatise and monetise it. So what do we expect from the Labor Party to stand up and represent us?
I'm going to try and answer that as briefly as possible because I could spend 10 hours talking about the Labor Party, right? But I just want to place a tiny bit of context there. Right? It's actually a really exciting time in the centre left of Australian politics because you start from the premise of where are we now and what have we achieved. The centre left of Australian politics, really dominated by the Labor Party for a generation, has been an incredibly successful movement. And the last time we really asked ourselves what we wanted to do and achieve was in the late 60s. Right? In the late 60s, in that Whitlam era, and people, again, I'll try and do this as briefly as I can, but in that late 60s period, the question we asked ourselves, had the Labor Party, after a long period of opposition, decided, hey, and this is a real debate within the left of politics, do we actually want to exercise power, or do we want to be a protest movement fighting the Vietnam War, protesting the street? And really, there was that big kind of Whitlam-Cairns fight, and Whitlam won that argument, which said, no, we want to be a party of power. And there was really four big ideas that the movement really built itself on. Universal healthcare, equality of opportunity when it comes to education, a savings base for the nation, and this kind of ideal of multiculturalism. Now, you can have different debates about whether or not universities should have fees attached or not, or this or that. But basically, fundamentally, the centre-left of Australian politics has been incredibly successful in achieving those four objectives. You can send your kid to a public school anywhere in this country, and based on ability, I'm not saying the system's perfect. In fact, I argue more than anyone else we need to better fund our schools through the Gonski model. But basically, we all know that our children can become nurses, teachers, doctors, police, or whatever they want to be with a certain level of ability in what is not a perfect system, but reasonably fair. We know that the healthcare system we have now is one of the best in the world. You wouldn't want to get sick anywhere else. We have an incredibly good superannuation system, though the rate should be higher. And multiculturalism, even though we've had migrant issues and problems and challenges, I'm a product of that, so I'm obviously going to be a big fan of it. The question now becomes, okay, firstly, accept that we've been incredibly successful, and that's something the movement never really does. Right? We've actually been able to achieve so much. That's been a part of the sector. The question becomes, what's next and where to now? And I think where it needs to go to is an understanding that power's changed, communities have changed, participation has changed, and the real smart space of politics is going to be kind of this decentralisation of power and this decentralisation of influence. And I think people really want to say back in a lot of their communities. And I think if you start providing that, I think that is where the politics is going to be heading. I think that's where it's going to head, regardless of what political parties may want. But I think that's the successful place, and that's where the Labor Party should become.
One right at the back there, big hand up there.
Yeah, so your colleagues, Sarah Neal and Tim Watts, also Dennis Glover and Laura Tingle have all written about some level of institutional decline and the institutional reform without key democratic institutions, whether that be Parliament or the public service. How do those kind of claims correlate with what you're talking about with the concentration of corporate power, and what reforms do you think need to be put in place to strengthen those democratic institutions?
I'll tell you where I agree and where I disagree. By the way, Tim Watts and Claire's book is sensational. It's an incredibly good book. It's called Two Futures. If anyone hasn't bought it, they should definitely buy it. I bought Dennis Glover's book. I actually haven't read it yet. I tell people I don't believe in an afterlife, but I buy books like there is one. So I have a George Brandis style. If you saw my book collection, you'd think I'm the most well-read person imaginable. I have these incredible books. I just haven't read them yet. It's a hobby of mine to buy books and not read them. But can I tell you where I slightly disagree from their analysis, right? And where I agree with them? What they're saying is completely right, especially what Tim and Claire say, because I actually know what they say. right? They talk about the weakness of the kind of institutions, decline of institutions, decline of institutions. But I think the answer, in my personal opinion, isn't about looking at those institutions and saying, right, how do you take those institutions back to where they were in the past? Is an acceptance that is the past. And it's not about institutions, it's about that decentralisation of power and influence. That is the actual solution. So I think part of the argument that those inside politics tend to think is, how do we fix our institutions? When I would actually argue, well, where is the power, or where should the power be? And actually focus on that rather than the institutions themselves. I don't know if that's a clear answer, but that's kind of where my thinking is at.
Just like two-part question. Why didn't Rupert Murdoch make your list? And two is, the car industry surely is a bit of an illustration of the decline of the power lobbies of a powerful industry. They've lost all their subsidies, they've gone. Why did they lose that fight?
Okay, there's two parts to that. I actually had on my list, I was going to talk about media, and I thought I was talking too long, so I didn't. The problem you have in the media debate in this country is that it's really dominated by two voices, which is News Limited and Fairfax, and out of the two, News Limited is far more kind of dominant of the two. Everybody talks about the opportunity, and there is. There's an opportunity here on, decentralisation of media. There's new outlets out there. There's the Guardian. There's kind of other web blogs. There's the New Daily. There's all these other kinds of institutions. But largely, the debate is still being dominated and being centralised. There's an opportunity there for that to change. Obviously, it's no secret that the newspaper model, as it currently exists, isn't how people get their information. And there's been 1,000 PhDs written on all of this. There is an incredible amount of power in there, but actually the power of someone like Murdoch and News Limited isn't what it used to be. It's not what it was. It's actually not what it was. In terms of the car lobby, I actually want to make a different point about the car lobby. The car lobby and what happened with the car industry is firstly a win for the financial services sector, not as the council of lawyers make an argument against it. But it also demonstrates this lack of power that people feel like they have in their own communities. And here's what I mean. I was talking to someone who actually used to be at Holden Plant, and they said to me, back in the day, we used to know the rules. And the rule was this: if our plant is profitable and doing well, we all have jobs. Right? That was the model. Can we make our cars? Are we making money? If we're doing well, we all have jobs. And if not, the plant's going to get shut down. And they all felt invested. Now these decisions get made at board meetings somewhere in Europe by a bunch of people who don't even know there is a Holden kind of factory out somewhere in, Victoria or Adelaide, that are making these decisions based on a whole set of numbers that have nothing to necessarily do with what is going on the ground in the plant. And people feel completely disempowered and out of kind of control. One of the senior financial officers for one of the big oil and gas companies told me this story, that 20 years ago, they used to all get together at the international conferences, these big oil and gas kind of, I don't want to name the company, but they're all, name and shame, right? But they used to get together at their big oil and gas kind of company AGMs, and all the kind of financial officers of different countries used to get together, and your bragging rights were about how profitable you were. If you're a more profitable branch, you're doing well, and you might get a bonus, this, that. Now they're completely judged on how they've structured themselves as much as possible to minimise their tax obligations within the country they're in. In fact, you get rewarded on artificially making yourself less profitable than what you really are. And I think there's that sense of, when I look at the car lobby point, the point I make is, firstly, there's a whole different debate about, do we want to be a country that makes things? I think we should. I think we should have a manufacturing base. I think we should do top-end manufacturing. But putting that aside, I think there's also this whole thing about power and how disempowered people feel and how these decisions get made.
One here.
Thanks for your tremendous enthusiasm. On the basis of the High Court decision today, that's going to potentially allow Australian-born children of asylum seekers to be sent back to Nauru and Manus Island, And contrasting that with the US 14th Amendment, which declares that any person born even of an illegal migrant in the USA automatically gets US citizenship. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, look, definitely. It's actually something I find this something I think we all do, and I in particular find it very, very kind of difficult. You know, I think I mentioned at the start. You know, I was born in Iraq. You know, my parents came here during the end of the Iran-Iraq war. We came here as economic migrants. Perhaps in different circumstances, we could have also have applied through refugee status. My parents were student activists. They were potentially, you know, a lot of their friends were executed, and they were facing kind of really difficult circumstances. So the idea, and I look at this, and I look at the opportunities that Australia's given me, and my story, and I think to myself, well, it's completely sensible and rational that people would want those same kind of opportunities in those kinds of difficult circumstances. I mean, it makes complete no sense. You know, July last year I went up and I spent a couple of days in the Zatar refugee camp on the Syrian border. And you look at these people and you hear their stories and you hear their plight and you start thinking to yourself, well, hang on, we're this incredibly wealthy, successful, rich nation that has been, you know, so lucky, and yet we can't have a proper debate about migration. We haven't been able to have a proper debate about migration for almost 20 years now. You talk about where the United States is at, you know, with their kind of 14th Amendment, but also I ask anyone, if you actually have a chance, go and actually have a read of Reagan's final speech that he gave, his parting speech as president. Reagan's not exactly, you know, this icon on the left, but he talked about America as this shining city on the hill, and about, you know, if it was going to have walls, those walls would have windows, and you'd be free to anybody who could find the will or the way to get here, right? And that's Reagan, right? And you look at where the world has kind of headed to, and you ask yourself this question, which says this: how do you get the balance right between making sure you have a fair, a safe, an equitable, and an appropriate refugee processing system, and also nobody, and this is the straw man argument that gets put up by the right, nobody wants a situation where people are dying at sea in their bid to come to Australia. No, nobody wants that, right? Nobody, you know, you'll have the conservatives who throw out figures and say this many people died at sea, and it's true, and that is horrible, and that is horrendous, and that is an awful thing. But why does it have to be either of those two options? You know? Why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't you actually talk seriously about proper refugee processing happening in places like Indonesia, in our region, and actually have, you know, a proper system in place? I think that's the answer. But the debate has become so polarised, so emotional, and unfortunately the other thing it's actually done is it's actually stopped us having a real debate about immigration in this country. And we don't really talk about migration. We can't talk about a big Australia. We can't talk about the fact that, hang on, and the person who's done this really well lately is actually Michael Fruilove, and his lectures I don't really had a chance to catch up with him. And Michael does a really good job. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about another institute, the Law Institute. They're not really competitors of yours. They do more foreign affairs. But talk about this idea of the big Australia. And we haven't been able to have that debate because our migration debate has been so kind of condensed.
So,
One here in the middle.
Yeah, Peter Tate. Thanks, Sam. That was a really, really good talk. You keep talking about the decentralisation of power. I'm really interested by what you exactly mean by that, and also how you see it happening, and what's going to make it happen, how's it going to unfold?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, and again, I don't want to keep everyone here all night. Okay, firstly, I think it's in two parts. I'll talk about it slightly from a Labor Party perspective, which means that the Labor Party itself has needed to accept that we need to have much better open systems and processes within ourselves, within our own party. And we kind of trialled all that with, you know, how we elect our own leader, and I think that's an exciting space to be. I think political parties should head down the path of primaries. I've been arguing that for a long time. I think that having the primary style model for selecting candidates is not a perfect model, but it certainly allows more voices in that to be heard. That's within a political party, and that's an internal Labor Party kind of debate. It's relevant, but, you know, you're not here to hear about the Labor Party. But that's part of the debate. I think is going to actually be political parties themselves open themselves up. But my argument on why political parties should do that is also it's in the interest of parties to do that. And I've argued it within the self-interest of the Labor Party for our own future growth as an organisation as well, and for the pursuit of our ideas. How it happens at a community level, I think, is a lot more open. And I wish I could come and sit here and give you what I think the clear answers are, because I don't think there are those answers here. I think there's the anger. I think there's the frustration. I think there's the seeds of a movement. But I don't think the movement in Australia has really caught fire yet. And I don't think it knows where it's going to go. So in a place like America, it's gone into strange places. Right? It's gone down, on one hand you've got this kind of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, which has really said, hang on, enough's enough, and they've used this whole idea of the 1%, but it's about more than the 1%. It's just about a frustration about the centralisation of kind of resources and power within a group of people. And at the same time, we've gone and seen this other kind of fringe of this Tea Party, which, let's face it, has nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party or the principles with which for which so much blood was shed over so many generations. But yet, is really also, in a different way, about people feeling like they're frustrated about centralisation of power with a completely different view on how it should be. And the idea that it's being run by people like the Koch brothers is just so ironic that we don't even need to go there. And it's happening around the world. I think there's the seeds of it here, but how and where that goes, I genuinely don't know. But I think it's going to go somewhere in the next couple of years. I wish I had an answer. If I did, I'd write a book.
I've got one for you that you alluded to earlier, which is about political donations and the Labor Party, and how much you think political donations have driven the ownership of the Labor Party or its policies in the past and now, and what should be done.
Okay, firstly, my huge conflict of interest, right? There's probably, I'm trying to think if there's a handful of more people in Australia who raise more money than I have over the years. Okay, so there probably isn't, right? I'd probably be in the top 5 or 10 people who fundraised or raised money for a political party in the country anyway. Right? So I'm not going to bullshit them. Oh, look, I captured it, this and we all are, this and that. No. I have raised money. Now, here's the problem with the system. And I think there's a couple of problems with it, but fundamentally the problem becomes this. Firstly, you don't want the US style. So I'll tell you what I do. I believe in a completely public funded system. I believe in a system with spending caps and expenditure caps. And I think that if you actually go down that path, it leads to better politics. And I think it leads to better politics for a couple of reasons. Firstly, about 4 years ago, I met with a couple of US congressmen or whatever. And they were saying that they spend 85% of their time raising money. Right? 85% of their time raising money. That's what you do in the US. That's what you do if you're a US politician. You just raise money. Now, the problem with that, putting aside conspiracy theories about being bought and corruption and all these things, even if you're the most innocent person who's not going to be influenced by any of the things, right? Just forget that. How is it good for policy development in a country where the people who are there to make policy are spending 85% of their time focused on raising money? Not to mention the fact, who are the 85% of the people you're then spending your time with? You're spending 85% of your time with the people who can contribute to a political campaign. Right? So naturally, they're the only voices being heard. And that's putting aside conspiracy theories about corruption and influence and being bought off and this and that. Putting all that aside, just the basic numbers themselves are scary. And what I think we end up happening, so look, from a Labor Party perspective, most of our donations come from the trade union movement. The trade union movement and the Labor Party, in my opinion, are the same. It's a whole different relationship. That's a whole different debate. I think the idea, they're so intertwined with one another, the idea the Labor Party is being bought because we have donation to the Labor Party from union movement fails to understand just how intertwined the two kind of institutions are. But the broader idea that says where we're heading to, and this is really dangerous, is it's an arms race, right? And fundraising becomes an arms race. And in New South Wales, we introduced spending caps and we introduced expenditure caps. And we introduce donation caps, and the system's better for it because you don't want your politicians spending all the time raising money.
we are out of time. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the Senator for a fantastic discussion of power. It's something that we like to talk about a lot at the Australia Institute, where power resides and what to do about it. We've had a great discussion from the Senator about it. Please put your hands together and thanks.